Hello, everybody, and welcome to this special episode of America's Public Forum. I'll go ahead and do the formal introduction in just a moment here, once a few more people have funneled in. Actually, tell you what, we'll go ahead and get started because it looks like folks are hopping in as we start. So on behalf of American Purpose and Braver Angels, I would like to just greet everybody and welcome you all to a very special episode of America's Public Forum. For those of you coming in from the Braver Angels community, this is a special opportunity that American Purpose offered to work with us on, and so we're excited to be working with them for the first time and hopefully not the last time. For those of you coming in from the American Purpose community, this event is being partnered with Braver Angels, a national grassroots depolarization organization, in a special part of the program called America's Public Forum, which we can, which later on, I suppose, we'll have a chance to talk about then. Just wanted to introduce this to everybody, though. This is a conversation with the Honorable Governor Tim Pawlenty on race and policing and the state of politics and parties in America in 2021, hosted by Jeff Gedmin and John Wood Jr. So I'll turn it over to those two in just a moment here, but I want to go through a very quick tech talk so everybody's aware of how the tech will work on this. So number one, please keep yourself on mute over the course of the first half of this. As soon as we get to the Q&A section, we'll be calling on people to ask questions, but keep yourself on mute until then. If you would like to ask a question, you're going to use the raised hands function. If you know how to use the raised hands function, please go ahead and show me now. When you have your Zoom hands raised, that is how our hosts will know that you have a question, and you'll be asked to unmute yourself to ask them. Great, you can put your hands down now. Additionally, as you come up with questions, it will help you and it will help us to chat those questions either to John Wood Jr. or Jeff Gedmin so that they can take a look at some of the things to figure out how to structure this conversation, or you can text them to myself or to Robert Bork, who will be helping them with getting questions ready as well too. And to do the chat function, you just go to the chat function on the right side of your screen. You'll see you can chat myself, Robert Bork, John Wood Jr., and Jeff Gedmin. And if you have any questions at all about the process of the event or anything like that, feel free to chat myself or Robert. We'll be happy to help you with that. So without further ado, let's go over to our gracious host of this afternoon's event, Jeff Gedmin, editor of American Purpose. Jeff, back to you.
Luke, thank you very much for making this possible, and to you and the colleagues at Braver Angels and our friend David Blankenhorn and others, tip of hat. We're very appreciative. Could you all do me a favor? You know, I'm not a big fan. I actually like it in person, believe it or not, but here we are. If you're in a position to do so and you have your camera off, would you switch it on just for a moment to wave and say hi so that everybody can see everybody? And then, of course, isn't that nice? It almost looks like a group of people you'd like to spend time with.
Jeff, you have gone on mute.
If you need to switch off and multitask, we certainly understand and respect that. But thanks for switching on for a moment, all of you, so we can say hi. So thank you, Luke. Thank you, John Wood Jr. I'm going to say a word about you in a moment, our co-moderator. And thank you, Governor Pawlenty, for being with us today. Governor Pawlenty, I think it was almost exactly 10 years ago that you announced on the Piers Morgan CNN show that you were running for president. And of course, eventually you would endorse Mitt Romney, become co-chair of his national campaign. When I go back and read about you from those days, I read you described as a fiscal conservative, a social conservative. I think even once, but you'll correct me if I'm wrong, you corrected or amended and said you see yourself as a religious conservative. Humorously, a number of commentators from that period a decade ago said that you were a man of principle and conviction, who didn't offend the other side because you were so pleasing and appealing and easy to get along with. One of the criticism was you were too Minnesota nice. Well, you'll have to explain to us what that means. And I think, pick a state. I think we could use a little more nice these days as we work out all of our arguments and our positions. To me, Tim, you've been someone throughout your career as a legislator and as a governor and as a candidate for president who in a very rare way combines principle and conviction, because God knows you do have that, with respect for the other. And you have resisted consistently this, I will call it, infection in our society where we demonize or even dehumanize those who disagree with us. So I think that is encouraging, inspiring, and very helpful in times like these. So Tim, what we're going to do, as you and I discussed, is we're going to have with us now John Wood Jr., whom you've met and know out in Los Angeles. Hi, John, and welcome. He is National Ambassador for Braver Angels. He's other things. He's a writer. He's a public intellectual. He was a candidate for Congress. He ran against Maxine Waters. And John, you and I don't know each other properly. We'll see today whether we get along. I'm fingers crossed that we will. We're going to do this together. But we're going to interview you, Governor, for the first half. And then it's going to be an open floor. And we'll get in as many questions and as many comments as we possibly can. Governor John, sound okay?
Sounds great.
All right, here we go, friends and colleagues. Governor, I'm going to start, and I'm going to ask you, originally when you and I set this program up a month ago, we talked about concentrating on the future of the GOP, and we'll get there, I hope and trust. But we had a lot of news this week out of Minneapolis, and it seems appropriate that we start there. My first question is, your read, your takeaway from the trial, from the verdict, where do we stand? How do you assess the situation? But paired with that, Governor, going forward, we have big issues about, well, I would say police and policing, but also about race and reconciliation. I would like to ask you that in addition, are we asking ourselves the right questions? Are we identifying the right problems as we go forward? Pick a spot, jump on in.
Sure. Well, first of all, let me add my voice of thanks and appreciation to America's Purpose and also Braver Angels for hosting this event, but more importantly, trying to do the good work of convening people who are interested, want to be engaged, and want to try to help move our political discussion to something more civil than just yelling sound bites at each other. So that is incredibly important work. It may not be always as glamorous for those of behind the scenes who have to put this all together, but convening people in the spirit of civility, hopefully thoughtfulness, listening to each other, even though we may not always agree, and trying to find some common ground is a great and noble cause. And so tip of the cap to both organizations and to everybody on this meeting for embracing that spirit and being part of it. As to the George Floyd trial and the events leading up to it and the outcome of that trial, what happened to George Floyd was wrong. It was sad. It was tragic. It was devastating on so many levels, and it was criminal. And the jury found that to be the case in a resounding way. And what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd was criminal murder. And that's what the jury found. And so I think the outcome in the legal proceeding was appropriate to the facts and the events that led up to that jury's deliberations and ultimate decision. But obviously, it's a moment of inflection for lots of other reasons. And it hopefully is an opportunity for us to now step back and say, what's the broader set of issues here? What more can we learn? What more can we do to be a better country, to be have better politics, to have better policies, to have better communities, and to better ourselves? And I like to always start with some context and history. And it's important, I think, for all of us to remind our fellow Americans that we are only a little more than 150 years away from slavery. And for those of us who have had the benefit of opportunities that others in America have not had, think about a situation where your grandparents or your great-grandparents were in that situation. And of course, the descendants from that are put in positions where they missed opportunity, didn't have opportunity, were frozen out. It wasn't even until the 1960s that we had the basic Civil Rights Act and framework that we now have in this country. And of course, for a long time, even after that, we had informal problems and still have formal and informal problems around race in the country. And so when you think about it, we're just 2 or 3 lifetimes removed from slavery. And we have to think about how do we continue to address the need to catch up those who didn't start the sprint of life, if you will, to use a metaphor, at the same starting point as most of the rest of us. And there's a lot of work to be done in that regard in terms of policies. There's a lot of work to be done in that regard in terms of attitudes and just basic recognition of that context and those facts. And we're not fully there yet. We've made strides, we've made progress, obviously, as a nation, but much more work needs to be done. And I think that leads us to a discussion about where do we go next. And just maybe to finish out, Jeff, you threw out a whole bunch of stuff there, but on the limited topic, recognizing there are many more topics of policing, obviously, I think the idea, from my opinion, defunding and dismantling the police is a naive and dangerous idea, of course. But that doesn't mean we can't try to find ways to unite around modernizing and improving and reforming law enforcement in this country. And there are many, many examples. I'll just give you a few and then we'll throw it open to the next question. But of course, we need to expect body cameras now be worn, other technologies be used, and that they be turned on all the time. So we have less disputes about the basic facts that are available through today's technology, and hopefully that'll be continued to be enhanced going forward. Number 2, as a nation and as states and as cities, we don't need to over-criminalize nonviolent behaviors that are oftentimes mostly attributable to chemical dependency and mental health issues. And so we need to find ways, when we have those individuals in those circumstances, to get help, to put them on a path to assistance and recovery and intervention, rather than, in all cases, criminalization. Because if you have nonviolent offenders that are mostly acting out with behaviors that are attributable to chemical dependency and mental health, and you end up just over-criminalizing that pattern of behavior, you begin to lock them out of housing, educational opportunities, job opportunities, and of course, the cycle that we see continues to move forward. And then I think we also need to come to terms with, do we or don't we have a consensus around when law enforcement officers can use lethal force? And are there better alternatives to lethal force? And that's a whole nother discussion, but I think it needs to be reviewed. And, we have recent cases where, if a law enforcement officer encounters a situation where somebody is about to do imminent harm to another or cause death to another, is that officer, authorized to use lethal force? And the tradition, the training, the protocols, the expectation in the discussion in our history so far has been yes, clearly yes. But now that's being called into question. And so that's on the higher end of the continuum of what we can do. But from my standpoint, if you have a situation where somebody is about to kill another person or visit grave bodily harm on them, we have to give law enforcement the opportunity to do something that will neutralize that threat. And so taking that away or questioning that in ways that may be Going too far back the other way is also not helpful. Obviously, these are all hypersensitive issues, but I think worthy of further discussion.
Hmm. Well, Governor, first of all, I have to register a complaint with you. You are so thorough and comprehensive in the answers that you've given so far that you've already preempted a number of the questions that I may have been planning to ask you, which is good because that means that we can continue to cover more territory. I do want to stick with the thread on policing, but I want to take it to the Minnesota context and to sort of the local community context, generally speaking. And I want to give you this this larger sort of prism for understanding the origin of my question. Braver Angels co-founder Bill Doherty, I don't know if you're familiar with him, but Professor Doherty is a family therapist, professor at the University of Minnesota, the architect of most of our workshops and facilitation programs here at Braver Angels. He's also the founder of a project called Police and Black Men in Minneapolis. And over the last several years or so, this program has been very successful in bringing together young Black men and law enforcement officers in dialogue, in community building, in collaborative relationships, in a way that set the stage for an awful lot of productive discourse and connection between these two groups of people who in most communities find themselves perhaps rather polarized. And this program has been very successful right up until the point of the tragic killing of George Floyd. And now, a year or so later, in the aftermath of the trial, it looks as if this program may be likely to collapse, largely due to the fact that many of the officers who were participating in that program are themselves leaving the force, because it seems like we have a situation within which, frankly, for reasons that I think might have been in some respects alluded to in your comments and with which we will all be familiar, find themselves very much stigmatized as a profession in the context of the larger conversation we're having as a country over race and policing. I live in South Central Los Angeles. I'm raising a family in South Central. Many people within the law enforcement community and within the general community in South LA, although I wouldn't profess to speak for everyone, of course, but many people would say that police and community relations in the inner city parts of LA, of Los Angeles, had actually largely improved, certainly over the course of the last 30 years and even over the course of the last 5 to 10 years. And I believe that there is a concern that many people have that while we need to have a deep and comprehensive and sympathetic conversation as a nation over race and policing, there may be ways in which the national storyline winds up butting into the local reality in a way that perhaps does not reflect the local reality, but then perhaps proceeds to reconstruct that local reality in the national image of the breakdown between the two groups. And so I'm wondering, from your seat as governor of Minnesota during your time, and even in the aftermath of your governorship, so much as you were able to see, what was the quality of relationship between the law enforcement community and the African American community and communities of color in your state? Do you see Derek Chauvin as being, indicative of, the sort of baseline culture of the force that, as you knew it during your time and following thereafter?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I do know Bill Doherty from the University of Minnesota and am somewhat familiar with his work and appreciate his attempts to try to further the dialogue on a whole bunch of fronts, and appreciate his work, including his work in inspiring and helping to lead Braver Angels. So thank you for bringing up and referencing him. In terms of race and policing and the relationship at the community level and the implications of that more broadly, of course, when I was governor, this was back between 2002 and 2003 and 2011. So now over a decade ago. And we certainly had our fair share of tension between certain local police departments, but of course, most prominently Minneapolis, and communities of color. There's no question about that. in my recollection, it seemed less negative than it is now. But again, a decade ago, it may be that my recollection is not fully accurate. But we had a number of challenges, and to the point where I think I recall sending in, if not the National Guard, the State Patrol to help Minneapolis deal with spiking crime and deteriorating relationships with local police in at least one summer, if not 2 summers, during my time as governor. So I think sort of the point of your question in part is, has this gotten worse or not? This is an unfolding story that goes back, I think, many, many decades and had ebbs and flows. I think in light of what we've seen in recent months and years in the country, and of course the perception and the reality from the communities of color in our country, they're not finding the current state acceptable, and of course for understandable reasons in many instances. So regardless of whether it's gotten better or worse, the current state is not something we can just embrace as an acceptable status quo. It's going to have to be reformed and changed and improved. And I suppose the hopeful note is nothing stays the same. Nothing does. And so, change and hopefully progress is part of life for all of us. And that includes for policing and relationships between police and the communities that they serve. I do think you also touched on another point, which is a question. Who is going to go into law enforcement now? We need law enforcement. And I would say, in my experience, the vast majority of the men and women who serve in public safety and serve on the front lines in public safety jobs try their very best and discharge their duties in law enforcement and public safety with honor, with fairness, and with appropriateness. And then, of course, there's some small percent who don't. And we need to figure out how to make sure those folks don't get into law enforcement, or if they are there, they're removed more quickly than in the past. And also, I think part of this is the training and technology and techniques that are available. I mean, a lot of these protocols around policing and law enforcement haven't changed in a long time. And I think whether you're Republican, Democrat, Independent, something else, or nothing, we can all agree that this is worthy of review. I think we can also agree that getting rid of police, there's some voices in Minneapolis just saying we're going to have a police-free community. I mean, to me, that's just not credible. I mean, it's not credible. Can we do better with the police that we have, or can we reimagine policing in more modern ways? Of course. But this idea that we're going to have a society where it is, no police, we have rules for living in community that are necessary because of the nature of human behavior. But somebody has to enforce the rules, and you have to have the ability to enforce the rules, because if the rule becomes anything goes, pretty soon it does. And I think to think otherwise, like I said before, is naive.
Jeff, if you don't mind me standing on the mound again for just
Please do, John.
Okay, absolutely. Tim, as I listen to you speak, it is of course pleasing, I think, to hear the deep empathy with which you treat the subject of race, and you have I think a clear willingness to reach beyond some of the stereotypes that people sometimes attribute to conservative politicians as being disinterested in this sort of reconciliation, whether that's a fair stereotype or not. But I want to talk to you about that and about the Republican Party and its relationship to communities of color in America, and sort of how you grade the party and leadership at the highest level in terms of the quality of that outreach. I'll say that many folks would look at, let's take President Trump, for instance, as being a person who radically inflamed polarization generally in America and race relations in particular. At the same time, you would have folks who would point out that President Trump's share of the vote in various minority communities, including, I believe, the African-American community, actually rose a tick or two in the 2020 election. And you do have folks, including folks I'm sure present on this call, who are strong supporters of President Trump, who are people of color. How do you wade through the nuances of this to arrive at an appraisal of the overall condition of the Republican Party's relationship to and credibility with communities of color and perhaps the African American community
Sure.
in America?
Well, of course, the Republican Party, a little context in history, is the party of Lincoln. It's the party of Grant. It's the party that put forward, at least on a proportionate basis, more votes than the Democrats for the Civil Rights Act of 1964. But in more recent decades, you'd be hard pressed to point out a thing or two or three that Republicans have led on that would help in the area of civil rights and racial equality. Certainly, there's a lot of efforts that help indirectly, but in terms of something that you can explicitly point to, it gets more difficult in more recent decades. And so one of the things I think a lot about is we have a tension, inherent tension in our country between the constitutional promise of equality and liberty. And to be oversimplified, Democrats tend to put their thumb on the scale for equal outcomes, and Republicans tend to put their thumb on the scale for liberty. Both are important, both are in tension, both need to be balanced. But if you're a Republican and you're saying, it isn't the job of government to provide a guarantee of equal outcomes, it's a job of government to provide a guarantee of equal opportunity. And by the way, we're going to emphasize liberty. You have to come up with some solutions then consistent with our principles, the Republican principles, that help everybody, especially the disadvantaged, including the African American community. And so, for example, if we are the champions of capitalism, as opposed to using government as a centralized distributor of resources in an inefficient way, we would argue, use capitalism as a more efficient way to gather and distribute resources, then capitalism and the benefits and opportunities of it have to be available to more people, to everybody. And we as Republicans, I think, could do something significant by saying, look, the ante into capitalism, if you're going to participate in the free market for most people, unless you're lucky enough to get an inheritance, but the ante into capitalism for most people is you have to have a skill or an education that's relevant to the economy of today or tomorrow that allows you to participate in the private market, in the private economy. If you don't have that, you are marginalized in a big hurry. So the Republican opportunity in all of that is to say, let's once again be the champion of education reform and improvement, with particular focus for those school districts and communities that have been lagging in terms of racial inequality or educational inequality in America. Number two, if we're going to be talking about spreading the benefits of capitalism to everybody and not necessarily doing it through government, Republicans, I think, could make great progress and do a great service to our country by coming up with programs that are designed specifically to provide market opportunities in terms of capital formation, capital deployment, entrepreneurial activity, business assistance, and employment assistance for those disadvantaged communities in ways that are consistent with Republican principles. I think the Republican Party has, ebbed and flowed at a low level in terms of support from communities of color. It can't be a national governing majority party unless we improve upon that. And yes, President Trump did do a little better with some members of the minority communities and border groups in our country, but not a lot. And if you look forward to the political demographics of the future, the Republican Party can't be a governing party nationally when you lose so much. So you're so far behind with women, younger voters, minority voters. The math just doesn't work. And so even setting aside the merits of the argument, just from our own political self-interest, we should be doing better at outreach and producing results for those communities.
So John and Governor Pawlenty, thank you very much. John, it's spot on 12:30 Eastern. And I know, as you and I discussed yesterday, we're very eager to get as many people involved as possible. Let me try this. It may not work. The hands are up and the questions are streaming in. Let me try to bundle three together. It'll help us understand the the mood of the room and what people are reacting to. And it works if you're brief. And if you ask 4-part questions in paragraphs, my grand idea falls apart. And I was going to call on Winnie Mading and Catherine Furlani and Wil Shields. And I'm using first name. I don't mean to be offended or be disrespectful, but we're going to try that if you go along with that. And Winnie, could we call on you first? And could you tell us where you are?
I'm in Wisconsin, outside of Milwaukee.
Welcome.
I think immediately going to the defund police is a problem because very few are saying police should not be able to intervene when someone's life is at risk. The problem seems to be that too many police automatically see black, they see danger, regardless of what else is going on. And we keep hearing, oh, train, train, train. As far as I'm concerned, that's worthless. We need to better find a way of vetting people wanting to get into police, to be sure that we don't bring people into the police force who have overt or covert racist attitudes.
Winnie, not to interrupt, but if we can sharpen it into a question so we can get as many people in, that would be great.
Okay, how do we make sure that we don't bring people into police force who have inherent biases, which may affect what they do?
Okay, Winnie, thank you. Hold your fire, Governor. Let us get in Catherine and Wil, then we'll get you in, Governor, and then we'll turn it back to John. Catherine, where are you from today?
Yes, I live in Suffern, New York, in just 30 miles north of New York City.
Welcome.
And my question is also related to this issue of defunding the police, because I know from the people that I have listened to who work in Black Lives Matter as activists, and even in my own county, the work that's been done on changes that need to be made in policing, that what I understand is that defund the police doesn't mean that you don't have police departments or that you eliminate them. But that money that has been, masses of money that have been given to police departments be redirected toward things like mental health, investing in the community, and the things and the services that the community needs. And it seems to me that one of the problems is we don't listen to one another. You know, we don't listen to one another carefully. You know, we react and make assumptions about what people mean about things without fully gathering all the information that we need. The other thing that I wanted to ask is, what do you think is the purpose or the role of policing?
Okay, Catherine, thank you. Tim, hang on just for 1 second. We'll bring in Wil Shields and you have a chance to reply. Wil, who are you? Where are you calling from today?
I'm Wil Shields. I'm from Jeffersonville, Indiana. And I was wondering about how do we make America better and more peaceful and people stop killing each other with guns? How we stop the hate, and what can we do after January 6th to get back to the Republican Party and get back the country back together?
Hey, thanks, Wil. Governor, back to you.
Well, on the first question of training and screening, I think there's improvements that can be made. You know, of course, I've studied, as I'm sure some in the audience have as well, the application and screening that goes into becoming a law enforcement official in our country. And it's pretty robust, including psychological training, or excuse me, screening, but it probably could be improved. That's for sure true. And I think, you know, also when we get into the training, even though the initial question sort of discounted training, you know, we also, I think, could do better by making sure our law enforcement officials are equipped as best as they can be, physically and mentally, to take steps short of lethal force when something less might suffice. And, you know, we've had proposals, for example, to say, you know, all law enforcement, at least frontline law enforcement, should be at least a purple belt in jiu-jitsu or something similar. And the point of that isn't, you know, just jiu-jitsu. It's, do you have the capabilities mentally and physically if need be, to intervene in a way that's short of lethal force that still might, de-escalate or control the threat without having it rise necessarily to a lethal threat. And the point of that is, the inference from that is, we have some folks who either ill-trained or ill-equipped, so that they feel threatened. The first thing they do is reach for the gun. And we might be able to find some improvement doing what I'm suggesting as one example. As to the second set of questions, mostly around what does defund the police mean? I think we would all be better served in our country if we meant the words we said. And when I hear defund the police, I interpret that to mean defund the police. And if they mean we really want to keep the police, but we'd like to redirect some of the resources or add some resources to provide for mental health ride-alongs or community policing or justice systems that aren't in the traditional footprint, then say that. But what happened, I think, let's be candid with each other, is some people put out a political phrase called defund the police so that they could appeal to an element of the mostly the political left, I guess, in this example. And it became horribly unpopular. And then they had to backpedal and say, well, we didn't really mean it. We meant these other things. Well, say what you mean what you say. And if you didn't mean, if it didn't go well for you, then say, I'm sorry, we made a mistake. But to say, the other side's at fault because they're misinterpreting the words defund the police. When people take it as literally defunding the police, I think the people who spoke the phrase to begin with maybe should be the ones that are responsible for the confusion. And then as to the last point about unity in our country, the premise is this, I think. If you look at Congress, 435 districts in the US House as an example, there was a study done not too long ago that showed that the vast majority of those districts are overwhelmingly Republican or overwhelmingly Democrat. And the implication of that is that, if you're in one of those districts, there's only probably 30 or 40 competitive districts in the country. But if you live in one of those non-competitive districts, you're at no risk of losing the general election unless you commit a felony. And even then, in some districts, it's questionable. The only risk to losing your seat is somebody in your own party. In the case of the Democrats, further from the left, challenging you in a primary or an endorsement contest because you're not sufficiently left, or in the Republican Party, challenging you further from the right. So all the politicians in those safe seats tend to watch their further left or further right flank, depending on their party. And what that does, of course, is sort of calibrate the thinking of those politicians to those party flanks. And if we want to find more common ground, then people in the country who maybe don't agree with those extreme flanks need to participate. Politics is just a lagging indicator of our political culture. And these politicians reflect their behavior, their comments, their positions reflects their political accountability system. And if we want to change that, if you're unhappy with that, then more people who have a more maybe pragmatic or different view need to get involved early in the process. To give you a quick example, if you go to Iowa, the Super Bowl of American presidential politics, they have these caucuses in the middle of winter. State of Iowa, I think, has about 5 million people, plus or minus, and a few 100,000 show up in the caucuses. And that's the Super Bowl, early Super Bowl of American presidential politics. And so not many people participate unless it's November in a presidential year. And we need, if we want different results, we have to have different accountability systems.
Governor, thank you. And John, back over to you.
Okay, well, Jeff, you seem to be doing a pretty good job bundling these questions. Should we keep bundling or shall we call on folks one by one?
Well, I'm going to defer to you. We've got 20 minutes left and your judgment, John.
Okay, gotcha. Okay, well, I'm looking for raised hands. So if somebody wants to throw a hand up, I'm going to call people as I see them. Let's go with Nicholas lluzzi. Nick, go ahead and ask your question, but be sure to keep it sharp.
Thank you. My question tends more towards a general stance in the Republican Party. The Republican Party is is predominantly controlled in its upper levels by white Americans. My question is, how is it that the Republican Party can gain the credibility it needs and the proper messaging to engage with the African American community in a way that both helps the community develop and brings more people into the fold of the Republican Party?
Great question. Well, I think like so many other institutions in our country, the Republican Party needs to look like the faces and voices of a changing America. And there's a lot of work to be done in that regard. There's certainly some progress or some faces and voices that have helped diversify the Republican Party, but much more needs to be done. And hopefully that will unfold on an accelerating basis over time. But also beyond just sort of the diversification of the party, it also has to have policies that are attractive to a broader group of Americans, including communities of color in our country. And I wrote a recent op-ed for the Minneapolis Star-Tribune, probably back in January or so, and it basically said this, that the modern Republican Party was the party of Reagan and all that that implies in terms of policies and tone and the like. But clearly the party has given way, and that was, I described it as Reagan conservatism, but the party has given way to Trump populism. And I think populism sort of can be a double-edged sword. Populism means of the people, or it's popular. So in that regard, it can be helpful if more people are feeling more positively about your party or your movement or your enterprise. But Trump populism has taken on a tone that has alienated some of the Republican Party and some independent voters. And so that has to be calibrated as well. But at the end of the day, it's not just about what the face or voice is, it's also what's the message and what's the substance underneath that message. And I think Republicans need to do a better job demonstrating, A, that they are aware of, care about, and are willing to use political capital to make progress on behalf of disadvantaged communities in this country. And we don't have enough of that in this party by a long shot.
Thank you very much, Governor. Let's go next to Peter Skerry. And if you could keep it concise, we would appreciate it. But go ahead, Peter.
Yes, thank you. Well, I want to applaud the governor for his tone and demeanor, given the situation among Republicans these days. That's extremely welcome. And I also find myself very much in agreement with the various suggestions and discussions we've had about the importance of training police. But I want to issue a kind of dissent from the prevailing tone so far. The governor mentioned that we have a tendency to criminalize behavior when we discuss these problems. I understand that and I agree, but I'm also concerned that there's a tendency in our political culture, especially in recent months, I think, to sentimentalize behavior. By which I mean to say, the recent dreadful killing of the young teenage woman who was wielding a knife is a case in point. It only slowly comes out. We hear repeatedly that her mother, not surprisingly, thinks that she's a loving, wonderful young woman. Well, how did a loving, wonderful young woman wind up with a knife in her hands? Well, gradually we're finding out now that she was in foster care. I don't know what that's all about. That opens all sorts of questions. But what it boils down to, and what I'm getting at, is that in order to develop the political will to do what we need to do to address our deeply seated obligations to African Americans and to overcome the history that the governor correctly alluded to, we've got to convince a lot of white Americans who aren't on board right now that personal responsibility and the personal responsibility of African Americans has some role to play in what we're up against now.
Let's bring it to a question mark, Peter.
Well, that's the question. When are we going to talk about the personal responsibility of African Americans not just the training of cops. And it's important to emphasize here, I hold a candle to no one in terms of what we owe African Americans. But I also believe that the discussion is so one-sided, and I fear this discussion is so one-sided, that we're not going to bring along the vast number of the huge numbers of white Americans who are not on board, and we can't forget them. That's just as important as reaching out to African Americans to bring them into the Republican Party, it seems to me.
Got it. Thank you very much, Peter. Governor, your response.
Yeah, the issue of personal responsibility extends to all of us, and that includes every race, every ethnic group and background. And I hope that nobody takes from this conversation that we're releasing any individual or any group from personal responsibility and accountability to things like the rule of law. I mean, we have to have rules. We live in community, and human behavior is such that if you don't have rules, some of our fellow community members of all different backgrounds will misbehave. And then there has to be some group of people who are willing and able to enforce the rules. Otherwise, you'll have chaos. I mean, so it is that simple. But within all of that, we have to have personal responsibility. I don't think it's inconsistent, by the way, to say, if you were in a disadvantaged community and you were born into socioeconomic disadvantage, and you're born in a zip code that has not a very good school, and your parents and their network don't have the kind of doorway opening opportunities that many of the rest of us have had. You've been historically held back from access to capital or opportunity or institutions. It is important for us to recognize that certain communities, particularly communities of color in our country, have not started at the same starting point. So when you say you must do this or that, you also have to understand, if we're running this race against each other in terms of opportunity and outcomes and success, you can't say somebody else is less responsible when they started 10 yards behind the starting line. That being said, all of that being said, it's not inconsistent to say we do have expectations for each individual to be responsible, including, by the way, we expect you to follow the law.
Indeed. Thank you very much, Governor. Now let us go next to Michael Metro. Michael, go ahead and ask your question.
Look, it's interesting. I'm glad the timing is really good here, because my question is, like, how do we, we're talking about these issues in isolation on some level, when in actuality, like, the symptom of over policing and the symptom of economic inequities they're all symptoms of a much larger problem. And I wonder how do we address, for this topic specifically, the issue of if it's training or if it's the screening process or technology, all of these things that are influenced by
Michael, we lost your sound, Michael. I think we may have gotten the thrust of Michael's question, though. He wanted to know about things that we can do in the context of the larger societal disparity linked to race. Governor, go ahead and respond to the question as you heard it.
Well, first of all, I think the main building block is we have to get as many people as possible to be able to obtain a skill or an education that allows them to access the economy in a meaningful way. And so none of us can really function in terms of a capitalist society and having opportunity to markets unless we have a skill or an education that's relevant to those markets. And I think we need to revisit as a country, Republican, Democrat, all of us, this premise. What we are doing in education is not working for as much as 30 or 40% of the students in America. Those students who are most being left behind are from disadvantaged communities. So simply doing more of the same is not working. And if we can't get consensus or agreement on that basic principle, we're going to have a long road to go then to figure out, well, if somebody's uneducated or undereducated, unskilled or underskilled, they can't get a job, they can't access the economy, then the call comes for more government housing, more government healthcare, more government transportation, more government transit, more government everything. It becomes a cycle. And again, can we please, let's take the Democratic dream scenario on education, whatever they want, try it. Take the Republican dream scenario on education, whatever they want, try it. We have to try everything, because continuing to have a system that yields roughly a third of our future citizens being undereducated or uneducated or underskilled is a disaster in terms of our the ability to maintain that or sustain that in any reasonable way. So that is job one. It's foundational. All the rest of the stuff about, we can't afford healthcare, we can't afford transit, we can't afford this, we can't afford that, we got to have government do it, sort of flows from that. Not all of it, but some of it. So I could go on in each of those categories, but if you want the number one most important thing we can do from a holistic standpoint to get more people more opportunity who currently don't have it, is to dramatically improve and transform our education system. And we've had Goals 2000, we've had Nation at Risk, we've had No Child Left Behind, we've had similar initiatives for 40 flipping years at the state level, and it hasn't worked. And here we sit here with our, bemoaning the state of things in America, and it isn't going to work to have 30% of our people disconnected from the economy, marginalized, and becoming, more dependent on government.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much, Governor. I'm hopeful we can get a couple more in if we move quickly enough. Ellie Grosso, let's go to you next. And there you are. And again, if you can keep it sharp, we would appreciate it. Go ahead.
It is so refreshing to hear from the governor what I consider to be truths and facts that we don't often hear, my perspective, from Republicans. These are the kinds of conversations that if Democrats and Republicans could have that are based in truth, we could come to some solutions. We can't solve things if there's one side that are not even willing to have a conversation like this. So my question, I guess, is how do we get other Republicans to speak in the vein that Governor Pawlenty is speaking, and also in that same vein, the police who testified in the Derek Chauvin trial and their truth, for me, allows for some real change to happen. So I would like to hear about how we can encourage other Republicans to speak like Governor Pawlenty is. Thank you.
Governor, you've got some praise and you've also got a question. Go for it.
Well, as to the Republican Party, I think, the party is, for better or for worse, the Trump party now. And it'll change in the future, as it always does, to something else. But for now, it is a Trump party. And recent polling shows the number one and number two concerns of the activists in the modern day, Trump Republican Party is concerns about illegal immigration and the impacts of that on our country. And number two, a reaction to political correctness, perceived political correctness, and the stifling of political activity or thought by big tech or big business or big government. And of course, that is sort of a proxy for concerns around certain liberties. But that gives you a window, an insight into sort of the modern day Republican Party. The Republican Party won't change until it has to. And I think viewed by, again, rightly or wrongly, this success or relative success that Donald Trump had in terms of the election, I think there's a lot of people in the Republican Party saying not only does it not need to do something different, it needs more of that. So I don't have a good answer for you about how the Republican Party goes from that to something different. I think the political marketplace will sort that over time, but don't make any mistake about it. At the moment, this is a Trump party at the activist core. Doesn't mean all Republicans share all those views, but and then I forget the second part of the question. I'm sorry. Maybe you can help me, John.
Just in terms of policing and the sort of the historical code of silence, and getting police and leaders in the police force to speak up and do what you're doing. I mean, I wish you were doing this nationally and people like you. I'm imagining from what you just described about, the Republican Party is the Trump party, that you might be someone who would really be wanting other people who are in your position or similar position to you to speak up as well. It sounds like from what you're saying that you're not happy with that, the message coming.
Thank you.
Yeah, on policing, I do think, and again, this is anecdotal, but I do think you're seeing through the George Floyd trial and otherwise, an acknowledgement by many in law enforcement that things can be better and should be better and need to be better. So that's hopeful, because some of the most powerful change is when the group that needs to be changed is willing to change from within. And so that's a hopeful sign. So I'm glad you identified that, and I hope it fuels. It's one thing for outsiders to say we need to change this or that, and then have the folks who do it every day resist. It's another thing for the folks who do it every day come and say, you know what, we do this every day. We know what we're talking about, and we hear what you're saying, and here's our suggestions on how to be better. That's a powerful discussion, and it's a powerful dynamic. So I'm hopeful for that. And then in terms of the Republican Party and voices within it, mostly I think I wish I could say there's a whole bunch of people who are out doing something different, but that is not what's happening. I think it is a continuation of sort of the Trump dialogue. And I think you'll see some new voices. You look at somebody, for example, and again, I'm not suggesting this from a partisan standpoint, but they describe in Florida Governor DeSantis as, a smarter version of Trump, that he has many of the same views as Trump, but is able to explain them and communicate them in ways that are perhaps less polarizing. And so you might see a figure like him, or somebody like Nikki Haley or others come forward who share perhaps some of those priority policy values, but are able to communicate it in a way that's less polarizing.
Okay, outstanding. Well, look, I'm disappointed that we didn't get to more of your questions, folks. I know that people had their hands raised. We do hope to bring you back, Governor, because you have insights that are very much worth hearing, and a spirit, I think, that exemplifies the way we approach discourse, which is a welcoming of different points of view and an honest empathy for the experiences of your fellow Americans, black, white, left, right. So we want to applaud you, Governor, for being willing to participate in this conversation today. Thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me, John, and thank you for your great work, and to all those on the call as well.
Hey, John, I'm going to thank you, and Governor, I'm going to jump in with a final word to Braver Angels. And John, what a beautiful job in co-moderating. Thank you so much, sir. Luke Phillips, what a brilliant job in coordinating us. And let me leave you with this, a tech issue, that a video of this should be available on the American Purpose site starting at some point tomorrow, and we'll make that available to our colleagues at Braver Angels. And Governor Pawlenty, in taking notes before the conversation today and going back 10 years ago, I was looking at some of the themes of your campaign from that time. And you were standing at the time for fiscal discipline, rebuilding of the American middle class, fighting crony capitalism, and resisting the temptation to dehumanize your opponent. I would just like to say, second what John said, please let us have you back. And we needed you then, and we still need you now.
You're very kind, Jeff. Thank you. I appreciate that. Of course, I'd come back anytime, but I'm just grateful for our discussion today, and I hope it was additive.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Governor. Thanks, John.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Take care, everybody. Until next time. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.